We're going to be recording, as we mentioned. Good evening and welcome, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Mimi, Glenn, and the Becky Sisterhood for being the guardians of our Yom HaShoah programs at Becky. In the past, we've celebrated this somber commemoration in many different ways, in person and online, with testimonies of survivors, as well as art and poetry inspired by the Shoah. Tonight's program is different than others in that it will be more participatory. I have been inspired by the Shalom Hartman Institute's program, which they call Hitkansut. And Hitkansut means convergence, and it's an experiential and participatory ritual gathering designed to empower the next generation, which is us, to actively transmit memories from the Shoah to the future. We have invited participants to speak, read, or sing about memories, thoughts, or feelings related to the Holocaust. Some people will talk about the experiences of their family members, stories they were told by surviving relatives, or stories that were passed down through others. We will hear songs, one song from the before times to give a sense of the lives Jews were leading in Europe before the Shoah, and one song about the resistance that arose in European Jewish communities. We will also hear about the resistance from one of our participants, who is a recently retired professor of genocide studies. At the end of the program, Rabbi Woodward will share some words as well. As witnesses and participants, we are creating a safe space for remembering the horrors and sadness of those murdered, of families separated and broken, as well as the bravery and fortitude of those who survived by their wits, luck, and/or help from others. To create this space, we will mute all participants when they are not speaking so we can reduce background noise and distraction. We will open the program with poems and a communal candle lighting in memory of those who died in the Shoah. Some of you have candles. If you'd like to light them, I'll let you know when we're going to do that. I wanted to begin with a poem that I thought was especially relevant for this kind of program, and it's a poem by Elie Wiesel. How does one mourn 6 million people who died? How many candles does one light? How many prayers does one recite? Do we know how to remember the victims, their solitude, their helplessness? They left us without a trace, and we are their trace. And now we're going to light candles, and while we're lighting, I'm going to read a poem by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory, which I also thought was just a beautiful piece about Yom HaShoah. Today on Yom HaShoah, we remember the victims of a great crime. We remember what happens when hate takes hold of the human heart and turns it to stone. What happens when victims cry for help and there is no one listening? What happens when humanity fails to recognize that those who are not in our image are nonetheless in God's image? We remember and pay tribute to the survivors who bore witness to what happened and to the victims so that, robbed of their lives, they would not be robbed of their deaths. We remember and give thanks for the righteous of the nations who saved lives, often at risk of their own, teaching us how in the darkest night we can light a candle of hope. Today on Yom HaShoah, we call on you, Almighty God, to help us hear your voice that says in every generation, do not murder, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, do not oppress the stranger. We know that whilst we do not have the ability to change the past, we can change the future. We know that whilst we cannot bring back the dead back to life, we can ensure their memories live on and their deaths were not in vain. And so on this Yom HaShoah, we commit ourselves to one simple act, Yizkor, remember. And I am going to light my candle. Josh has. Going really well so far. Nope. One more. All right. This is the magic one. Yes. Okay. And now, Stephen Fraud is going to share some words with us, some memories from his family's experience. Stephen, you're on mute.
Now I'm
There you
okay.
go.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you, Shoshana, for organizing this and for inviting me. I want to talk briefly about the part of my family that was closest touched the Shoah, and that's my mother, Dorothy, and her parents, Otto and Carola Spitz. They lived in, there are two lessons that I take from this story that I'll come back to, and one is how much of who survived and who didn't depended on chance. And the other is how some people were able to foresee what was coming and take the necessary steps to leave in time, while others apparently didn't. And it's always haunted me to think, what would I have done in that situation? Would I have been a kind of the kind who sees the worst in the situation and acts accordingly, or tries to smooth over? It's not so bad, it'll pass, it's only words, that kind of thing, in response. Because I know in my own family's survival, that part of the family that survived, both in word play, that is sort of happenstance and foresight. And of course, happenstance you can't plan for, but forethought, perhaps we can learn something. So my mother was an only child, and lived with her two parents in Berlin. And they somehow saw what was coming relatively early. In 1935, they sent my mother to a boarding school in Switzerland to get her out of harm's way. And they went to Palestine, to the land of Israel, which was in Palestine, to see whether to emigrate from Berlin to from Berlin to Israel would have been possible. And they concluded, based on the economic circumstances then, that it would be very hard economically, financially, for them to give up the fairly nice lifestyle they had in Berlin for what would be a struggle in the land of Israel. My grandfather, my mother's father, either owned or managed, or both, a cigar and cigarette factory in Berlin, which apparently, of course, before we knew the evils of smoking, or most of us didn't know yet, most of us weren't alive, didn't know the dangers of smoking. But apparently the cigarette market was already flooded. There were already too many cigarette manufacturers in Israel, so they decided not to do that. But in 1937, I believe, my grandfather was arrested by the Nazis. He was arrested for a very simple reason, that he was a Czech citizen. He was born in Czechoslovakia. Maybe he had dual citizenship. I'm not sure, but he did carry a Czech citizenship. And there was some dispute between Czechoslovakia and Germany, in which Czechoslovakia took some German officials captive, and the Germans responded by taking a Czech citizen, my grandfather, prisoner. And we have an account from my grandmother, my mother's mother, of how she visited the prison every day to try to find some favor with the synagogue guards, bringing them sweets, being nice to them, which she credits ultimately to my grandfather's being able to escape before things got much worse. But as soon as he got out of prison, they knew things were going to be bad. So they packed up and they went in 1938 from Berlin to Amsterdam, thinking, as many Jews did, that Amsterdam was a neutral country and would be a safe haven to wait until the Nazi government passed away, and then they'd be able to return. But once in Amsterdam, and there were a lot of German Jewish refugees in Amsterdam at this period, once again, they had a premonition that this was not going to last. So shortly before Germany conquered Holland, they escaped to Paris. Once again, tried to establish themselves, but also knew that it was not the end of their journey. I should mention that my mother's mother's mother, my great-grandmother, was unable to join them in leaving Germany, then Paris, because there was a quota that allowed a certain number of Czech citizens to escape, and therefore he could get out on using his Czech passport, and take his wife and his daughter, my mother and grandmother, the immediate family, but could not take my grandmother's mother, because that was already one step removed in terms of the family relationships. So she ultimately died. She was expelled, along with many other German Jews, from Amsterdam to Auschwitz in, I'm guessing, the mid-40s, early to mid-40s. So that's the happenstance that because of course, before they could go from Berlin to Amsterdam, they had to go back to Prague to get my grandfather's passport visa renewed, and then figure out how they were going to get my mother from Switzerland to join them in Amsterdam. Plus, my grandfather's mother was elderly and was still in Amsterdam, in Berlin, I should say. So my mother had to go back from Switzerland to Berlin at the age of 15 or so to rescue her elderly grandmother and bring her from Berlin to Amsterdam, where she died of natural causes, unlike my grandmother's mother, who died in Auschwitz. And then finally, they knew somehow to leave Paris just before the Nazis took over France, to make their way first to Cleveland and then to New York, where they had to rebuild their lives. So on the one hand, had my grandfather not had a Czech citizenship, a Czech passport, who knows, they probably would have joined my grandmother's mother. And my grandmother also had a brother who died in Auschwitz, who they couldn't get out. So they were able to establish themselves in New York. So there's a certain amount of happenstance, but also tremendous ability to I know we also tend to want to deny the worst. Can't happen here, can't happen to us, it'll pass over, it's only words. But they somehow, I don't know, I never really discussed this with them, were able to somehow see enough to know that they needed to flee. I mean, the other story, after the story, which I won't go into except to just mention a forthcoming book, is how they resettled themselves in America, in New York, and established themselves professionally. And here there's a very interesting story about my mother's mother, who was actually my mother's adoptive grandmother, because my mother's biological mother died in childbirth with my mother. Carola Joseph Spitz already was a student and then a practitioner in Berlin of a method that she called physical re-education. If you're familiar with the Feldenkrais or Alexander method, these are essentially schools of exercise for teaching the body its proper posture, and working with pregnant women during pregnancy, people with certain kind of psychiatric needs that could be psychoanalysis could be supplemented through physical. She was sort of into yoga before it was yoga. And she had to transport this school of hers from Berlin through Amsterdam, through Paris, to the United States, first to Washington Heights, and then to the Upper West Side, where she was actually very successful and quite a guru, if I may say, of people in the so-called somatics movement, who take a kind of whole body approach to healing of the body. And as it would happen, this past week, a English translation of a German biography of my mother, which deals a lot with her family and the transition from Berlin to New York, as well as the establishment of herself as a teacher, a professional woman, at an age in which most women were not professional or as professional. So the book was published in German by a German press, a German scholar of American studies, a few years ago. And just this past week, I was told is out in English translation, which we are eagerly awaiting. I'll show you the cover and end with this, to end on a positive note. Sorry about this. You can take my word and I'll read it to you. Oh, there we go. The book cover. The title is Breathing in Manhattan. Carola Spitz, or Speed is her professional name, the German Jewish gymnastics instructor who brought mindfulness to America. And that's already listed on Amazon and will be distributed by Columbia University Press. So I take from this, then in some sense, the story ends with on a note of hope. She ended up with a very large family of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But in order to get there, they had to go through terrible times. And I think what really enabled them to succeed was the tight-knit nature of their family of 3 and an extended family of many more. So I'll end with that.
Thank you, Stephen. We're going to have to book you for a book talk once. Have you read the biography yet?
I've read parts of it in the German, but my German is not what it once was. I should say I collaborated very closely with the author in terms of interviewing members of the family and reminiscences and going through her papers, of which she seems to have stored everything. That's a whole other story.
That's great.
We have the correspondence. It's very sad, actually, of once they got to New York, trying to get my grandmother's mother out through all sorts of channels, Dutch, American, German, telegrams going back and forth, booking her place on a boat, but not being able to get her a visa.
Yeah.
And there's one line that's always stood out among my grandmother is writing to some Dutch official to try to get my great-grandmother released before it's too late, as it became. And she says, paraphrase, she says, "What can they possibly want with an old woman? What could they possibly want with an old woman? What good is she to anyone that you would want to take her and not let her go with the rest of her family? What could they want with an old woman?" And you're going to multiply that by millions. And in some ways, that's as good a title as anything.
Thank you very much. Next, we're going to hear from Jessie Colombo.
Hi. Well, thank you, Stephen. That was really wonderful. And now that I look down at what I'd written, really a timeline for my mom and my dad, some of the things that you said were so poignant, and they'll come through, I think, in this working class story about happenstance or foresight. Let's see how it goes. Anyway, it's a bit different. Both my parents were teenagers when World War II broke out in Europe and somehow survived. They survived through the horrors of the war. My dad, Mietek Rosmarin, was born in Warsaw in 1923 and lived a fairly decent life, going to school, etc., learning a trade with his uncle, and so on. In November 1940, the Nazis forced Jews into the Warsaw Ghetto. They entered Warsaw without any defense. Somehow, my dad escaped with a couple of other guys who ran into the forest and were able to join a Polish partisan group, where he learned how to use guns and plant explosives. Those boys were not going to stay in that ghetto. Possibly they went through the sewers, my father would never say. In 1943, he helped smuggle arms into the Warsaw Ghetto for the planned uprising there. But he rarely spoke to my sister and I about his real experiences. But later on, we read about him as his friend Jacob Friedman wrote a book called The Reluctant Soldier. It was published in Melbourne in 2005, long after my father died. And we read all kinds of survival stories in that book. It was really a blessing that the survivors are able to, with their kids, put these small books into print. My mom, Hanna Turkerman, was born in Demblin, Poland in 1926. In the early 30s, the family, with 2 boys and 5 girls, moved to Miller 17 in Warsaw. Many of you may have read the book, Miller 18, which is really centering where the uprising was, Warsaw, the ghetto Warsaw. They were happy there with friends and relatives, the kids attending local schools, the boy cheder. They had a good Jewish community and they were happy. In 1939, when the Germans marched into Warsaw, rules changed. The Jews couldn't go to school, there was no work, and fearing danger ahead, my mom and her older siblings packed up and moved quickly to Białystok, Russia, where Jews could still go. They begged their parents and younger sibling to come, but they didn't want to leave older relatives. In 1940, Mum's 2 older brothers were immediately drafted in the Russian army in Białystok and somehow miraculously survived the war. Although my older brother, his wife and 4 children ended up in Auschwitz and they were murdered. In 1941, the Germans invaded Białystok and they forced the Jews into the Białystok ghetto. My mother's brothers were away in the army and others were enslaved to work in the farms and the fields and so on. But then in January 1943, the Germans liquidated the ghetto and separated families onto packed trains, sending them to concentration camps. My mom was sent to Majdanek, but her sisters and their children were sent to Treblinka, where they were murdered. From Majdanek, my mom went through a selection. Many of you have read what that entails, and sent to work in Blužin, an armaments camp. After a year there in February 1944, the women were transported to Auschwitz, where they were tattooed and heads shaved and submitted to really terrible conditions. There for 6 awful months, my mom got dysentery and typhus in horrible conditions, but had a couple of girlfriends who nursed her to recovery. 1944 August, as the Russians approached, the Germans selected 350 girls from Auschwitz to be transported by train to Wrocław near Trutno in Czechoslovakia to a factory to make valves for radio parts. My mom said, when they asked for volunteers, can you make valves? She said, you put your hand up. That was luck. Thankfully, in May 1945, they were liberated by the Russians. My mom didn't talk to us about the horrors. We read about those later in all the books that all of us have read, and heard talks from Mom's friends who had the determination to educate against hate. It took a lot of strength to have that ability to go into schools and talk to others and relive the stories over and over again. But we continue to ask my mum, how did you survive, Mum? And she would say, it was a survival instinct, resilience, having friends, and luck, just as Stephen mentioned. But we were always had to keep a positive mind, hoping for a good Jewish life ahead. Thankfully, my parents had a very positive outlook on life and a hugely menschlich value for community, which was the backbone for making a happy life with many wonderful friends in Melbourne, Australia. The dream of next year in Jerusalem also was repeated as a reminder of a safe place that we could always go. So I thank my parents for their strength and their stories and their menschlichkeit to pace how the stories came out. And now I have a summary. There's a lot of other little stories. Those can be told many times over in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessie. So very powerful. Rachel is going to sing a song for us and help us, give us a little flavor of life, I guess, in the beginning years before the war, you know, what life was like I think, are you going to put the words into the chat or we're just going to
Yeah,
listen?
So the first thing that I'm going to do, this song has a chorus
Mhm.
that is relatively easy. And I figured that since everybody is muted anyway, I will give you the words to the chorus in transliteration so you can sing along. So I think what I'm going to do, those are the words to the chorus. And what I'd like to do is I'll sing you the chorus so you have the melody. The chorus gets repeated twice, and then I'll tell you what this song is and where it comes from, because it's a fascinating song. So the chorus, so that you have the text there, it's in the chat, and I will put a translation of the lyrics up right before I sing it. It means we should all be healthy, we should all drink wine. The phrase literally means into the white day, which means well into the morning, we should drink wine all night into the morning, which will of course make us very happy. And so just to give you a flavor of this, it's gesund sollen wir sein, trinken wollen wir Wein, bis in weißen Tag herein. Gesund sollen wir sein, trinken wollen wir Wein, bis in weißen Tag herein. So that's the chorus, and you have the lyrics there if you want to sing it along with me. You're all muted, so no one will know. So this song is called Good Night. It's kind of a lullaby. It's kind of a wish. It's an evening wish for all the good things that we wanted as Jews in the little shtetls in the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe before the Nazis came. And what's fascinating to me about this song is that the song itself is a Holocaust survivor in a very interesting way. I learned this song in Vilna. I was in Vilna for a summer in 2008. And while I was there, I met a folk singer named Efim Chorny. He was Moldovan. So Moldova is a little teeny tiny snippet of a country. It used to be an SSR. It's right next door to Ukraine, and I can tell you that Moldova is very, very interested right now in what's going on with Ukraine, because they would be next. And Efim, he taught us this song. There were a bunch of us at a Yiddish program, and he taught us this song, and he said that he had learned it from an old man who had come from a shtetl somewhere in Bessarabia, sort of the Moldova, Belarus, Ukraine area. And that the reason that this man knew the song was that this whole shtetl had survived the Holocaust because it was so small and it was so remote. And the war that the West that the Allies waged against the Nazis was so well fought that the Nazis never made it to that particular shtetl. And it's this wonderful pre-war song of Jewish love and Jewish aspiration. And it was thanks to the resistance, it was thanks to the Allies, it was thanks to the entire world rising up against the Axis powers that almost, but not all, the Jews of Europe were murdered. And this shtetl survived. Of course, what happened to it was that it then became part of the Soviet Union, but that's another story for another time. And so here, what I've got here, which I hope you can all see, is the English translation of the Yiddish, but I'll sing it for you in Yiddish because that's how Fima taught it to me. So it goes, a gute Nacht, a gesunde Nacht, oi wünschen mir zu alle Jeden und zu alle feine gute Gesinnen, welche seinen alle da. Gesund sollen wir sein, trinken wollen wir Wein, bis zum weißen Tag herein. Gesund sollen wir sein, trinken wollen wir Wein, bis zum weißen Tag herein. Oi Gott soll geben zu jedem eine, was bedarf, noch sein Vernehme. Oi lechem beged lil boish, the yain kiddush lehavdolo. Gesund sollen wir sein, trinken wenn wir Wein, bis in weißen Tag herein. Gesund sollen wir sein, trinken wenn wir Wein, bis in weißen Tag herein. Oi Gott soll geben, als Mashiach wird kommen, und alle Jeden mit sich vernehmen. Ahin, ahin, kein Eretz Yisrael, wir sollen sein ein Volk mit Völker gleich. Gesund sollen wir sein, trinken wenn wir Wein, bis in weißen Tag herein. Gesund sollen wir sein, trinken wenn wir Wein, bis in weißen Tag herein.
Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful. Daphne is going to speak next. I don't know if everybody knows, Daphne Geismar has spoken on a Becky Zoom before. She co-authored a book called Invisible Years, based on artifacts and things that she and her family found that belonged to her ancestors who had been hidden in Holland during the war. There was a lot of family stories that had not been revealed. Is that correct, Daphne? And you guys were kind of piecing things together. And so once they found these documents and photographs, the surviving family members put together some really fascinating stories that they never had known before. So Daphne's going to do a little bit of a reading from her book, which is available wherever books are published. I think that the Becky bookstore, book and gift shop may even still have a copy or two. So it's a beautiful, beautiful book with lots of pictures and lots of stories.
Thank you, Shoshana. That was so beautiful, Rachel. And thank you for having me here. So this is the book that Shoshana asked me to read a little bit from. It was tricky to choose a little bit because in 2006, I discovered this huge family archive of letters and diaries and documents and interviews from 8 family members who became the narrators of this book. And once I had everything translated, I realized that no one person told the complete story of their time under Nazi occupation in the Netherlands, but that collectively their accounts told the complete personal story as well as much of the history of that time. So it's in 8 voices, and all 8 of them together tell about their life before the occupation itself, and then how their lives were slowly, how their rights were slowly taken away, and how each of their lives were affected by that. We had my grandparents were in their 40s at the time, and my parents and aunts and uncles who were adolescents. So we hear about this from these 2 generations. So to be brief tonight, I'm going to read just 2 voices because the idea is that it's kind of this conversation. So I wanted to bring in more than just one voice. And I'm going to start as my mother's family is preparing to go into hiding. And the 2 voices I'm going to read is my mother, Miriam, who was 11 at the time of this first excerpt. And then I'll bring in her father, Chaim, as the second voice. So this is Miriam. When the time came when we had to separate, we were told it would be for a short time. We already gradually had so many things we couldn't do. We couldn't go swimming, we couldn't go to the movies, we couldn't go to restaurants. So this was one more thing of the bad things that happened. When I first went into hiding, my hair was cut because long hair with braids makes you look more Jewish. My first name was changed to Manya. My stars were taken off all of my coats and sweaters. I remember being scared because being outside without the star was against the law. A couple of days before, my parents brought small suitcases to the hiding places. We couldn't have luggage with us because it would be too suspicious. We were all going to different places. We were not allowed to know where in case one of us was caught by the Germans. It was August 19th, 1942. I was 11 years old. My two younger sisters, Judith and Hadassah, were 10 and 9. We kissed and hugged each other goodbye. Don't cry, I was told. Everything had to look as normal as possible. Looking back now, I realize how much more awful it must have been for my parents to have to send their children away, not knowing how we would be treated, or even if they would ever see us again. And now I'm skipping to making a big jump. My mother had been in 2 other hiding places, and then her long-term hiding place was with a woman named Nell Van Fleet. And she's starting to talk about just arriving there. And she talks about 3 other Jewish children who are other children who were already hidden there when she arrived, who she didn't know. My mother's sisters were hiding in other locations. For a short while, we slept in regular beds in different rooms. It was a big house. Then the Germans started to unexpectedly search homes for hidden weapons, hidden Jews, and hidden pilots from downed airplanes. It became too dangerous at night because you couldn't get to a hiding place fast enough. A friend of the family came to make a hiding place under the kitchen floor. He made a trap door and then put linoleum over it. It was about 13 feet by 20 feet. I could sit in it without hitting my head. You could crawl in it. The 4 of us had to sleep there. 2 mattresses were put on the dirt floor. Every night at 7 for the remaining years of the war, more than 2 years, we said goodnight, and the 4 of us went down into the hiding place. We were not allowed to talk out loud when we were in there. You never knew who was above your head in the kitchen. I remember trying to read by the little light that came in through a slit in the wall. When it got dark, I went to sleep. And this is the last little bit from Miriam. Finally, in May 1945, the Canadians came to Haarlem. On the illegal radios, people started hearing, they're in Rotterdam, they're in The Hague now, they're in Leiden, and now they are in Haarlem and Amsterdam. That night, for the first time, all 4 of us could go outside without fear. No one was screaming at us. No one was pointing a gun at us. 5 years of horror were over. And this last section is by her father, Chaim D'Zuta, and it's from a letter he wrote to his 3 daughters after the war. This is just a little bit from the first page. When the war was over and we were free once again, days of great happiness arrived. I don't think I need to remind you, as that period must be sharply etched in your memory. But it wasn't just our freedom that was returned to us. It was as if life itself had been put back into our hands, for our very life had been stripped from us, which is to say from European Jewry. People had actually bid us farewell as if we were dying. And it wasn't because we deserved it that death, passing by us so closely, had spared us. As we went through the streets with this new life, singing on the inside, seeing everything in a different light. Be overcome by emotion is but a feeble way of describing the feeling that repeatedly took hold of us. For instance, when I saw one of you beneath the copper beech tree entering the garden of the Montessori Lyceum, or much later, as I stood on the other side of the canal overlooking the vast lawn, I saw you get off your bicycles right under the blossoming chestnut tree, only to disappear through the old gate of the Lyceum. Gladness and gratitude overwhelmed me. Gratitude to all of those who had supported us during the war years. But part of it too was an emotion of thankfulness that for now I will call divine. But this feeling was almost immediately stifled, remembering just one of the millions of cases where the children had not returned. Surely countless ones among them must have been 1,000 times more deserving than we. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. Mimi, are you ready? Are you ready to unmute Mimi Glenn? Uh-oh. Oh, here she is. There we go.
Yeah, there I am. Okay. Mimi is my nickname. Mary actually is my official name. Miriam is my Hebrew name. Leah's story, Lotte. In 1933, at the tender age of 15, Lotte Kleiner was separated from her family in Dortmund, West Germany, and smuggled to Copenhagen, Denmark. Some of her other members were able to come to family members were able to come to America, where they settled in Brooklyn, New York. They were saving money to bring the rest of the family to the US, but were not successful. War of attrition in Europe was progressing relentlessly. Hitler was swallowing up the small countries, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, and the north, Holland, Denmark, and Finland. Could nothing stop this diabolic monster? Could nothing stop Hitler? The answer has been written with the blood of the millions of innocent men, women, and children. Leah's separation from her family was not conducive to her place of mind well-being. She was harbored as a domestic farm worker with a Danish preacher and his family, and successfully passed as a non-Jewish. In 1935, a governor of Israel, Sir Herbert Samuel, granted many youth workers, known as HaShoah, a sum of money for the transportation to Palestine, which is today Israel, after 1948, when it declared independence from the British. She was situated in Haifa in a kibbutz Yagul, where her job was to milk cows. Reclamation of the land, making the desert bloom, and toiling with a group of youthful pioneers inspired Leah with joy, but also sadness, for she missed her family. After a while, she decided to go to the city of Haifa, where some of her German friends wound up. She became a waitress in a coffee house, where she subsequently met her future husband, Marcel Mordechai, who emigrated to Israel in 1933 from Romania. Also a pioneer fighter for Israel, he was an electrician by trade, as well as worked for a pharmaceutical company in the shipping department. They married and were blessed with 2 children. They lived in Haifa, in the center on Rehov Hillel of the city, where Leah ran a toddler daycare for 20 years. After the War of Independence, Leah wanted to travel to the US and see her family. Things were very hard in Israel, and Leah and Mordechai decided to emigrate to the US to give the children a better education. So in 1953, they settled in Brooklyn and then in Jersey City, New Jersey. There, they shared a happy life until her death in 1976. Mordechai came to New Haven, Connecticut, and lived with us till his death in 2006. Who were Leah and Mordechai? My parents. That's it.
Thank you so much, Mimi. Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Lauren Kempton, and she's going to talk about resistance, some of the resistance efforts.
I want to start with a quote that was taught to me by my friend Vlad Kamid, who I will be talking about, one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto. She said, "Just as memory serves the past, so does it ensure our future." And it was a quote from Elie Wiesel, actually. Tonight, I'm going to define resistance as artistic, spiritual, cultural, literary, and armed. If you resisted, you washed your face and you combed your hair, so you would look older and be selected for work in the camp. You also lied about your age. You resisted if you remembered the Jewish holidays. For example, Elie Wiesel's story, I Will Not Fast on Yom Kippur. You resisted if you secretly described the ghetto or camp happenings on any kind of scrap of paper that you could find. You resisted if you played an instrument in the Lodz ghetto when it was freezing cold. You resisted if you shared your ration of bread, even though you were starving yourself. And you especially resisted if you taught Jewish culture. There were secret schools in most of the ghettos, and there were real Jewish schools at Terezin. You resisted if you stored and smuggled weapons, which we've heard about, for armed resistance. And actually, I worked for Spielberg and interviewed survivors, and I truly believe if you lived another day, that was resistance. I want to talk about two types of resistance. The first is my friend Vladka Mead. Vladka Mead looked Aryan, so she passed as a Christian, and her job was to smuggle dynamite over to the Warsaw Ghetto for the planned uprising. At her memorial service, Michael Birnbaum shared a story with us, and he said, Vladka, where did you hide that dynamite when you were going, to from Free Warsaw to the Warsaw Ghetto? And she said, well, in my underwear, of course. And she was all of 100 pounds, so we had kind of a hard time imagining that. The next resistance was resistance in the Belarus. And there were two brothers, Tuvia Belsky and Zeus Belsky. And they weren't exactly upstanding young men, but they were well known. And they decided that they would hide in the forest. So one brother said, we must save Jews. And the other brother said, we must kill Nazis. And the brother that saved the Jews won and saved something like 3,000 Jews. Wow. But their life in Belarus forest was amazing. They had a rabbi, they had a wedding with a huppah, they had the broken glass at the wedding. And the movie's called Defiance, and it was written by Nahamatek, who happened to be a friend of mine. And there's one scene where Zeus rides up on a white horse, and Nahama whispered to me, that's the only thing that never happened. And there was a little Jewish boy standing there, and he said, are these really Jews fighting? So I think of all the subjects, and I've only taught this since 1986, of all the subjects that we teach the least, it's the subjects of resistance. And we must teach how important resistance was. The Jews were not led like sheep to slaughter. Yitzhak Zuckerman was a young man in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising who worked very hard. And he said, quote, if there's a school to study the human spirit, it should be a major subject, the force shown by Jewish youth to rise up against their destroyers, end quote. Resistance was such a huge part of the Shoah, and resistance happened in the smallest shtetls. It happened at Auschwitz. A young girl named Rose was the resistor there. But I think that we must always remember. And I happened to be a convert, and I decided to convert when I was at Auschwitz teaching for the 5th time. And I think when Jewish youth know about resistance, they are stronger Jews. So I think that we need to remember particularly the spiritual and the cultural part of resistance. And as much as we can, teach it and tell the stories for our children, so they must remember. We must remember.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And now we're going to hear a resistance song. And
All
Rachel, will you give us a little introduction?
I will. I think this is a song that does not actually need a whole lot of introduction, but tough. I'm going to give you one anyway. I'm putting the Yiddish into the chat, followed by an English translation. You probably know this song. This is Zognit Kain Mol. It's the partisan song. It's sometimes called the Song of the Warsaw Ghetto. because it was written in honor of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The poetry is written by Hirsch Glick, who was a member of the Vilna partisans. So he was in Vilna in Lithuania, and he was fighting. He wrote a number of different songs, and he heard about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is why Yom HaShoah is on the day that it is. It's connected to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And so he wrote this poem in honor of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And he actually set it to a song, a Soviet song, a Soviet Cossack song that had been written in the mid-30s. And as far as I know, this song was performed exactly once in the Soviet Union after the war by Paul Robeson under the title, The Song of the Warsaw Ghetto. And the Soviets were, I want to say, not terribly pleased with it, and it was never sung in the Soviet Union again. But it is the song of resistance. The poem is written in honor of the partisans, and the partisans took it up eagerly and sang it. And I am fairly sure that some of you know it as well. And since, of course, everyone is muted, please do feel free to sing along with me. Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst am letzten Weg, Gott Himmel bleien verstellen bläue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schar, es wird der Peucht und unser Trott mir seinen da. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schar, es wird der Peucht und unser Trott mir seinen da. Von grünem Palmenland bis weißem Land von Schnee, wir kommen an mit unser Pein, mit unser Weh. Und wo gefallen sie, so spritzt von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird dort unser Gwure, unser Mut. Und wo gefallen sie, so spritzt von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird dort unser Gwure, unser Mut. Es wird die Morgensonne begilden uns dem Heind. Und der Nächten wird verschwinden mit dem Feind. Nur halb versammeln wird die Sonne in dem Kajor. Wie a Parol so gehen das Lied von Dor zu Dor. Nur halb versammeln wird die Sonne in dem Kajor. Wie a Parol so gehen das Lied von Dor zu Dor. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist nicht kein Lied von a Vogel auf der Frei. Das hat a Volk zwischenfallen dick gewähnt. Das Lied gesungen mit na Gannes in die Hand. Das hat a Volk zwischenfallen dick gewähnt. Das Lied gesungen mit na Gannes in die Hand. Da sagt nicht keinmal, als du gehst den letzten Weg. Gott Himmel bleien verstellen bläue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schar. Es wird der Peucht und unser Trott mehr seinen da. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schar. Es wird der Peucht und unser Trott mehr seinen da.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I couldn't keep up with your Yiddish though. I did try mouthing along. Lots of syllables. And now, Rabbi Woodward, would you like to share some words with us?
Yeah. So first, that was really beautiful. And thank you, Shoshana, for putting this together, and everybody, and Stephen and Jesse and Rachel and Daphne and
Lauren.
Me and Lauren. I'm looking around the Zoom room. And Rachel, and one of the things that I really struggle with as a rabbi is thinking about the place of God in Yom HaShoah commemorations. And basically, I think that I don't like to give God a place in them. It just doesn't feel right to my feelings or what I'm experiencing. And that doesn't mean, though, that I'm not feeling some sense of God's care or presence for us. It's just that it's not a liturgy moment. I think it's a moment where the fact that we have these memories and these stories and that we find meaning in the work of memory, that means something. And Heschel would say that that feeling that means something, that's God. And it's kind of a minimalist definition in some ways, but the fact that we are coming together to remember and sing and tell these stories with these like little details, right? Like so many things that stood out in your stories were just like these sort of little quirks of something that matters. And I think if there's anything that we can think about after the Shoah, it's that people matter and their stories matter and their experiences matter. And the Shoah was an organized system of making people not matter, making lives not matter, experiences not matter, names not matter, shoes not matter, all sorts of things not matter. And we say, no, this stuff matters. And we light a candle, and I'm looking right now, Josh, at the way you have that candle in front of us, which is just like so beautifully framed. You know, the Jewish line about a candle is we say, Ner Hashem, Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam, which means the light of God is the soul of a person. And I think that means that the people we remember, or the people who we mourn, even if we don't remember them, they are the light in our world that we think about. And we might say that we don't find, maybe we don't find a Ner Hashem at this time, but we can certainly find a Ner Adam. We can find the light of our memory and the light of our work. And maybe deep down in that, we can find some connection and some sense that there is still hope and goodness. And ending with that partisan song, and with, you know, with Lauren, with your talk about resistance and the way that knowing resistance makes us stronger as Jews, as humans, you know, that's our great task too. It's to be able to live facing forward and take our memory to motivate us and help propel us into the future, full of love and memory and the strength of knowing that we can resist and we can survive and we can do beautiful things and we can be good and do that. And may we all continue to remember and never forget. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. All of you who shared your stories, we so appreciate it. Lauren, your teachings about resistance are so important to help us to understand the complicated dimensions of genocide, and that there are different kinds of responses. We're also fortunate to have Rachel Edelstein, an expert in Jewish music and a possessor of a beautiful voice, who shared, you picked beautiful tunes, poignant melodies to share with us tonight. I thank you so much. And to everybody who participated, thank you for helping us all to bear witness to the horrors of the past, as well as the hopes for the future. And it was nice to be here with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to be here.
There's a link in